Body modification, a world of familiarity to some and a taboo concept to others. For the indigenous people of the Americas and nearly every culture across the world, modification was and is a way of life. On the first episode of today's podcast, I speak with Gregory Smithers, an indigenous and African American historian, Virginia Commonwealth University professor, and author, to discuss the first instances of body modification on the land we now call the United States. So, would you introduce yourself for those who are not familiar with you?
Sure. So my name is Gregory Smithers. Friends call me Greg. And since we've known each other for like 60 seconds, you can call me Greg.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I'm a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University.
Nice, nice. So, getting into it, how would you describe body modification? What constituted as body modification for the indigenous people of the Americas?
Well, it really does vary.
Mhm.
It's a complex and nuanced history. That can include body modification to symbolize status.
Mhm.
So during the Mississippian chiefdom period, so we're talking like 700 in the Common Era through roughly 1600.
Mhm.
Um, Body modification was done for purposes of signaling elite status. And some of those communities from, modern day St. Louis down to, the interior of the Southeast, um, that those were hierarchical societies
Mhm.
in which leaders were elected, or I shouldn't say elected, were ascended to
Yeah.
positions of authority based on lineage.
Mhm.
And so the process of modifying one's physical appearance was done to reinforce that sense of lineage, but also connection to creator as
Interesting.
well. Um, that alters. So about the time that Europeans begin to invade the Americas or Turtle Island,
Mhm.
there is a shift going on, and there's sort of impacts of climate change across the North American continent that precipitate and quicken some of the social and political changes that are going on. Um, and so body modification becomes less associated uh, by about 1700 with elite
Mhm.
status standing, and more as a symbol of kinship in a more kind of horizontal rather than sort of lateral kind of context. Um, so people are sort of looking sideways to their kin,
Interesting.
rather than looking up, and they're modifying their physical appearance to kind of reflect that sense of kinship. So the sort of geographical nature of kinship and social and political structure changes too. So they become these small nodes of belonging, and layered on top of that is a sort of larger geographical sense set of connections, often
Mhm.
connected by waterways and rivers. And so part of the issue that I'm getting at is that the body tattooing and piercings and stuff that begin to
Yes.
emerge after the 1600s are designed for when you travel to these different towns within your larger kinship community to say,
Mhm.
oh, so you're part of the Deer Clan, or you're part of, um, Beaver Clan, or whatever it happens to, whatever the totemic symbol happens to be, and you have
Mhm.
it marked on your body, so it's you have that sort of recognition in that sense.
Right. When you talked about how when colonizers came over and people were not so much interested in like hierarchy systems, but rather in appreciating the fact that they're all one and the same. It sort of reminds me of like nowadays, like when like there's like something terrible, horrible, and like big that happens like in the US, how one of the main push that the government tries to push is like, oh, like nationalism and like everyone come together. I know that's like completely different than like what the indigenous
Yeah.
people were doing back then, but it does remind me of that.
But this is one of the things that people often misunderstand about
Hmm.
Native America and indigenous communities more generally. I mean, this is part of the very human story
Yeah.
that indigenous Americans are connected to, is that from the moment that they began to transition from being foragers and hunters to not only foraging but gathering, so collecting plant and seed and nut materials and storing them,
Hmm.
um, there was a sense of territoriality that they developed, a sense of
Right.
permanence to a locality. And when that happens, what you begin to see is people being very defensive of the territory and the waterways that they see as part of
Yeah,
theirs.
naturally,
And
yeah.
that's when you see an escalation in violence and a need to be able to easily identify who is part of the in-group and who's part of the out-group. And psychologists and sociologists have done studies on this, and there's like chemicals in the brain that are triggered when we engage in these types of rituals. We feel like we draw closer to
To the
the
people around
people we're
us.
part of. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And so that begins to sort of fall apart. And so what Indigenous people are doing in a time of climate change and then European invasion
Hmm.
and the introduction of racialized slavery as well, ultimately, is that they're finding new ways to position themselves in place in the landscape, but then also mark themselves as part of these sort of more egalitarian societies after that.
So, do you know of any ways where Two-Spirit Indigenous people were they modded in specific ways to showcase their distinct gender identity, or was it similar to the way that everyone else was?
Oh, it very much differs from tribal nation to tribal nation. But to talk about this in sort of broad strokes, I mean,
Mhm.
some people might try and signify their identity
Right.
through dress, manner of speaking, really roles that people take. So, daily roles, but also ritual and ceremonial roles that people take that would identify someone having these qualities of being able to shift between male and female and,
Right.
and sort of mediate the genders.
That is powerful. Wow. So in 2022, you published your book, Reclaiming Two Spirits. For those who don't know, what are Two-Spirit Indigenous people and how do they differ from today's terms like gender nonconforming, trans, things like that?
Well, there is overlap there. So, okay, first of all, I got to define two spirit. So, two
Okay.
spirit comes from an Anishinaabe word,
Okay.
specifically Ojibwe, which is Nij Manadawog. And Nij Manadawog basically means someone who has male and female spirits within them.
Okay.
They're typically seen as someone who is special, someone who has an ability to navigate both male and female worlds. They're peacemakers, they're often teachers, they're associated with an ability to nurture both the material,
Hmm.
biotic world that we live in and then the spiritual world. So in most Anishinaabe societies, they were coveted as, very special and very unique people. There are other traditions then that existed throughout the Americas to indicate gender fluidity. In some communities, that could mean that those people were respected in a
Hmm.
similar sort of spiritual and sort of mediatory way. In other communities, they might have been seen as sort of marginal figures who were considered objects of, in some cases, ridicule and jokes. So there's no uniform understanding then prior to contact with Europeans about the identities of these people. The the people we call today Two Spirit, the people who call themselves Two Spirit,
Hmm.
um, what one of the things that they're doing, and this project is ongoing, is they're continuing to use Two Spirit as this umbrella term, as you probably know,
Right.
that then allows for space to go back to their tribal nations and to excavate the language specific
To them.
to their communities.
Right.
And
Interesting.
that's been going on since about the 1990s when Two Spirit was, or when Nij Manadog was anglicized into the English Two Spirit. And at that time, Two Spirit was used because the terms that you alluded to
Hmm.
didn't quite feel right
Yeah.
to people who were then called gay and lesbian Indians.
Right.
They wanted something that reflected, because it wasn't just about gender and sexuality to them, and it still isn't. It's really a very spiritual and in some cases religious identity
Interesting.
that people who adopt the Two-Spirit identity have.
So, do you think there's a connection between the demonization of things like tattoos and piercings in Western society and the colonization of indigenous people and their land?
Um, I don't know if there's a direct correlation. I mean,
Mhm.
there's definitely evidence within the historical archive of a an antipathy on the part of Europeans towards body art,
Hmm.
especially in the way that it appears on indigenous people's bodies throughout the world, and particularly facial tattooing,
Hmm.
um, from, the United States Pacific West Coast all the way down to New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. There's definitely there's centuries long anxieties about that. One of the things that we see in North America, though, in the 17th and 18th century is this very deep unease that particularly the British feel for the way in which Native people are able to modify their physical appearance. So that means not just body art,
Yeah.
but also how they physically appear in terms of ceremonial a painting of their bodies and
Yeah.
faces, hairstyles, clothing that they wear. It was very confusing, particularly in places like New England. The Puritans found it really unsettling that native people that they thought they knew constantly were changing their identities and manner of dealing with outsiders. Um, so, and that was not in alignment with an emerging sense of trying to create categories of order in the world, both in human societies and the broader natural world.
Right.
And that only got worse through the Enlightenment and into the 19th century. But
Interesting.
yeah, that's something that anxiety from the perspective of colonizers was there very early. That sense, and what that reflected then was that native people couldn't be trusted, that this constant changing of their bodily appearance was a reflection of how they were duplicitous and underhanded
Interesting.
and
Which
kind
is
of
ironic.
shifty.
Which is ironic coming from them.
Well, right, given the long history that we now know of
Right.
of people, welching on treaty agreements and so
Yeah.
on. So, yeah, I mean, in some ways, yeah, you raise a good point. It's like a projection
Hmm.
fantasy. They're projecting their own identities onto
Yeah.
other people's to justify the way that they're feeling.
Right. So even so in modern day, we still see a lack of indigenous perspective and voice when it comes to like alternative culture and
Mm.
within the body modification, world, we usually see Western white people. Why do you think why do you think that is? Do people still feel disconnected from their indigenous culture?
Some people do, uh, but less so as I think about my own years working with people in Native communities,
Hmm.
almost 30 years now, and it's not as people don't feel as isolated as they used to. But I think a large part of this has to do with evolving media ecosystems.
Hmm.
So it was hard in the old media in the 1990s to have indigenous representations and voices heard.
Yes.
And there seemed to be a bit of a breakthrough happening at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. And in some ways, in retrospect, a lot of people look back at that, roughly 10-year window when the internet was coming online in everyday life, and then the sort of middle of the first decade of the 21st century, as something of a golden age
Mhm.
because the internet was very basic and people could create communities. That's why I write in the book that a lot of people thought the internet was creator's gift to Indian people
Interesting.
because it helped them connect.
Yeah.
And that was especially so in the Two-Spirit community. But then the problem became very shortly afterwards that algorithms begin to dominate our lives in the 20 teens and into the present. And so people become so siloed that they simply don't see those representations in their social media feeds, in their news feeds. It's like they don't exist.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Smithers. I really appreciate your time. This means a lot to
Sure.
me. I go to HBCU, so I'm used to hearing everything through the Black perspective. But funny enough, Hampton was a school that had both Black men and Indigenous men there. So I was like,
Did, yeah.
it makes perfect sense. And I feel like it would be an injustice for me not to speak on that. So I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you for educating me, educating the audience, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, you too. Nice meeting you.
You as well.